Welcome to the CEC Report for January 24th. I'm Elisa Barwick, and with me is the leader of the CEC, Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's CEC Report, Abbott demands action, not talk, on bail-in. Housing affordability crisis demands Glass-Steagall. And solar power is wrecking national power grid. So firstly, Abbott demands action, not talk, on bail-in. Now, as you may know, our Prime Minister Tony Abbott is right now at the Davos World Economic Forum in Switzerland, representing Australia. Before he left for the forum, he laid out his commitment to precisely what Joe Hockey has been the main advocate for over recent months, which is essentially the pathway to fascism. Now, what Abbott demanded was practical action in terms of the agenda of the G20 to be held in Australia in November this year. So he said, we can't just have a talk fest, we need action, action, action. Now usually that's a good thing. However, in this case, it's definitely not.
Yeah, I think for our viewers, at least, I think they're here. We don't just throw out this word fascism as just some sort of a tag to get people's attention. What we're talking about here is the idea of corporate governance, of the idea of private corporations literally taking over the role of government.
And controlling
government. And controlling the decisions of government. This is what Mussolini did back in Italy in fascism, and this is what fascism is. It's not just a glib title. It's actually it's a type of governance, right? And that's what we're moving into, where you see everything that's coming out of Abbott's and Hockey's mouth is moving us more and more and more to the large corporate takeover of Australia in every aspect, whether it be infrastructure or industry. The more and more emphasis placed upon the private profit of individual corporations, as opposed to what we stand for, which is the idea the role of government should be to support the common good or the common welfare, the general welfare of the population, which means controlling that private greed and that private corporate profit.
And Abbott talked about this exact idea really in his speech at Davos, which from go to woe was just pure free trade, market economics. He promoted markets ahead of the notion of government. Markets are the primary thing. He said wealth is not created by governments, but by profitable business. Markets, he said, are the proven answer to the problem of scarcity. We should all, he said, be missionaries for freer trade. And he talked about all countries renewing their commitment against protectionist policies, undoing any protectionist measures that may have come in since the GFC, etc. But this idea we should be missionaries for free trade, contrast that. It's such a stark contrast to what, for example, Pope Francis has been saying for some months, quite prominently now, where he said that the current global economic system, which is the system of globalisation and free trade, is an economy of exclusion and inequality. And he said such an economy kills, which is what we mean by fascism, because fascism started out as corporatism under Mussolini. We'll have a merger between governments and corporations to make better profits. It'll be better all the way around. Corporate owners can run business. They're good at managing things. We don't have enough money to go around, which is again what Hockey and Abbott have been talking about. We can't live beyond our means, etc. But that slippery slope led to what we saw with Hitler.
Well, it's interesting they use the word missionary, because that means that their free trade is sort of like a religion, which it is. I mean, it's a free trade is the dogma of Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith was the acolyte promoted by the British Empire to promote free trade. That's also, for people's memories, that's slave trading, that's the opium trade, right, the drug trade. That's what free trade actually started out as, and we actually have a DVD called 1932 that goes through specifically, that's the name of the DVD, goes through the difference between the British free trade system of slavery and the opium trade and the idea of the American system of the general welfare, the American system of political economy, to be precise. And there's a stark difference here. What Hockey and Abbott are moving into is what we warned about in this program last year before the election, is that we're going to see a government of more and more austerity, more and more you've got to pay your way, right? In other words, those who have lesser income are going to have to, just tough it out. You're already hearing calls for cuts in the real wage for Australians, the minimum wage. You're hearing calls for the potential reduction of old age pensions. I mean, this is a result of this free trade system. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Abbott in particular, because being a good old Catholic boy, here you have the Pope coming out with scathing comments, actually. Really scathing comments about the nature of how economies cannot be allowed to kill. In other words, come out against I think it's the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill.
And the deadline for this kind of implementation of fascism, such a deadline exists at the G20 in Australia in November, and this is putting our government under pressure to lead the way, lead by example, hence the less talk and more action. Now, Abbott did talk about the agenda of the G20 at this Davos speech. He mentioned promoting freer trade, tax reform, infrastructure. Of course, it's the innovative approach to funding for infrastructure, meaning public-private partnerships, which is to unleash the profit to free enterprise. Financial regulation he spoke about, and he talked about the previous G20 meeting at St. Petersburg, which defined this mission to make the banks that are systemically important fail-safe. We have to have measures in place such as resolution measures, meaning bail-in. And of course, Abbott said these reforms do now need to be finalised. So those reforms that have been on the table need to be done, and they need to be done as the chairman of the Bank of England and the head of the Financial Stability Board run by the Bank of International Settlements, whose baby the idea of bail-in is, has stated that Brisbane in November is when we have to have these global reforms passed for bail-in. But what does bail-in mean for Australia, for those that don't know? Craig?
Well, you have a system of number of banks, too big to fail banks in Australia. Right? That's the big four, in effect. They're too big to fail. I mean, they have something like $2.2 trillion in assets, which is about 1.5 times the size of Australia's GDP. These banks can't be allowed to fall over, otherwise the entire Australian economy falls over. So what happens, if you look at, as we've talked about in this program before, Elisa, the value of the assets of our banks to their capital is very, very low. The ratio is very low. It's something like 1 in 50 capital to assets. So if you have an adjustment in your assets, our banks are bankrupt. So what they want to do is to offset the amount of assets they have by reducing liabilities. And if you've got money in the bank, you're a liability to the bank, right? They consider your deposits a liability. So what they're intending to do is go with these resolution reforms through the G20, through the Financial Stability Board that Mark Carney from the Bank of England has been saying has to be done by later this year in Brisbane. They want to literally be able to take your money and forcibly convert them into shares. That's called bail-in. Now, we've been on a massive campaign on this, and we published an ad in early December last year where literally hundreds of leading representatives said, we do not want bail-in, we want to move to Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall meaning that we have to quarantine or separate the commercial banking system from the merchant and speculative sides of the banking system. We have to break up the big banks and actually protect the commercial banking system from itself, in a sense, because it's so engorged on speculation.
Taking out the speculative factor that would cause these banks to collapse, hence necessitating bail-ins and bailouts.
So bail-ins on the agenda. It's been pushed hard. It's not been talked about very much. We know for a fact it's a subject of mass discussion right throughout the bureaucracy. They've been preparing for it. They've been telling us they're coming. It's coming, right? We've got the documentation. We've produced the documentation in A New Citizen. We've now produced a new pamphlet as well, which will be available if people want to call up for it. It's called Glass-Steagall now, and the point is that the intention is to protect the banks ahead of the people.
And the financial system inquiry, which Hockey is leading, will lay all this out from the standpoint of how to put, as they've been saying, business ahead of the general welfare. Now, we'll stop there, but when we come back, we'll talk about the housing affordability crisis. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Housing affordability crisis demands Glass-Steagall. Now, following on from what you and Robbie discussed last week in the CEC Report, we issued a press release this Wednesday, January 22nd, on the fact that rising unemployment is going to leave a lot of homeowners, a lot of investors who have invested in investment properties to rent out, etc., at the risk of not being able to pay the mortgage. Now, that in turn puts the big four banks in a lot of strife because so much of their business is in mortgages and has kept them afloat for some time. Now, there was an article this week in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 20th of January about how Australia's banks are too big to fail, and this is echoing much of what we've been saying and pumping out there finally. And some of the figures in it were rather shocking, and it shows what's really at stake if we don't solve this banking crisis. Now, the article laid out that the assets of the Big Four, as you mentioned in the last segment, Craig, are 1.5 times our entire national income. So that's $2.2 trillion, the assets of the Big Four. The Big Four banks make up a quarter of the entire Australian stock market. Since 1995, the combined balance sheets of the Big Four as a percentage of GDP have risen from 93% to 193%. The only place where banks have grown faster in proportion to the entire economy is the United Kingdom. Now, the author of this article, Clancy Yates, said that this means authorities have no choice but to bail these banks out if they get into trouble, and as we have uniquely said, he didn't mention it, but also to bail in depositors' money. But in the meantime, before they crash, the way they're keeping themselves afloat is by binging on home loans. They're just sucking in money basically to keep themselves afloat. Of course, the rising home prices are a part of how they rake in that money. You've now got a resurgence of the low doc loan problem, which is being reported in the media, where you have loans going out again on, for example, a 1% deposit, self-certification, loans being coupled with credit cards, so they're hooking people into this bubble. And of course this affects every Australian, whether you're a young couple wanting to buy a home, whether you're grandparents funding or supplementing your children's home loan, etc. And there's just a complete lack of affordable housing in this country, which is a huge problem.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make some comments on that because every year this organisation called Demographica put out a report. This is the 10th annual Demographica International Housing Affordability Study of 2014. It's available on the internet. The point though is that Australia, if you have a look at us, we have the 4th and the 5th least affordable housing in the world out of 360 different regions, different cities, right? Now, this particular graph that I'm holding up here now shows you the severe housing unaffordability of Australian houses, right? Now, they work it out that 3 times the median income is what you should be paying on a house. That makes a house affordable. But Australia, on average, has 5.5 times, right across Australia. There are no affordable housing areas, cities in Australia.
And
right?
There's no reason for that, no particular reason why
well,
it should be
it's a
that
deliberate
way.
policy, Elisa. It has to be a deliberate policy. Here we are, a huge country. 2 people per square kilometre is our population density. We have enormous amounts of land, but we have no development policies to create regional cities, regional development cities, like we've talked about before in this program. Look, have a look at this. I mean, this is the housing affordability trend, Australia, in the major markets. And look at that. Sydney has 9 times the median average to get into a median wage to get into a house, and Melbourne's not much better, 8.8. That means you have to earn 8 times your yearly income in order to be able to buy a house. Now, this is a deliberate policy. Think about the banks. 60% of all their assets are tied up in mortgages, right? If they don't keep inflating and keeping a shortage through government planning or whatever in the housing market, the value of those assets, mortgages, are going to fall. What does that mean for the too big to fail banks. It means that they become bankrupt overnight. So this is a deliberate policy. It cannot be anything else. We've got huge amounts of land. This is a policy. This is a policy of free trade. This is a policy of globalisation. This is a stupid policy that we've inherited in this country based upon
the market,
what
Abbott was
supporting
going on
the
about.
banks and everything like that. And we can completely transform that if we were to build cities, regional cities, support them with manufacturing, high-speed trains, very cheap electricity through nuclear power. Then we can actually solve this issue.
Yeah, and we can burst the bubble by implementing Glass-Steagall, taking the speculative investment and derivatives factor out of the banks so that they don't need to be completely sucking money and fostering the speculative bubble, etc. By doing that, by putting the firewall between the deposits in banks and the speculative side of banks, we can effectively take the hot air out of this system, and you'll tend to see housing prices quite naturally come down.
I think you have to go back into history and look at what Chifley and Curtin did with the banks during the war. The banks would have happily profited from the war. They would have happily made millions for their depositors. They would have happily, sold out Australia. That's the nature of banks. That's the nature of private corporations of this type. They require regulation. They require government policy to say, no, you will not do this for the benefit of the people. And you can't shy away from that fact. That's the result. That is actually the responsibility of government, and it's a responsibility that Abbott and Hockey are basically throwing away.
Yeah, the responsibility of government is to allow big business to make profits, Craig. Haven't you heard, Mr. Abbott?
Make profits and kill people. I mean,
exactly.
kill people in the sense that...
In effect, as Pope Francis said, is
that's
the
what he
effect
said.
of the policy.
That's the effect of the policy. Now, did they pick up a knife and stab someone? No. They do it by actually making it impossible to live in hot days.
Now,
like we've had recently, this spate of very hot weather. It kills people because they can't afford the air conditioning or the cooling systems because the electricity is too high.
and we'll talk about that more after this break, how solar power is ripping us all off. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, solar power is wrecking national power grid. Now, joining me now is Jeremy Beck, who's our Victorian State Chairman and resident engineer. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Elisa.
And we're going to talk about how all electricity users, in fact, are actually subsidising those with solar panels. What some viewers may not realise is that electricity retailers are forced by the government to buy renewable energy certificates, and they've got to buy a certain number of these, which go to funding the solar panel installation that people get subsidised to do. And so in turn, the retailers end up putting up their prices, which we're all copping, except for the people who've got solar panels that are, sometimes raking in the money. Now, in the beginning, maybe this was acceptable because solar panels were expensive, but as the cost of solar panels have dropped dramatically, the governments are still doing this, and in fact they're paying premium price for the power that's fed back into the grid by the solar panels. The Queensland government, for example, pays about 70% above the current average price for power put back into the grid by solar. Now, another major factor is that reportedly this could cause the collapse of the overall national power grid. Can you elaborate for the viewers why that is, Jeremy?
Well, the conventional power-fired, the coal-fired power stations, they really work most efficiently when they're running over 80%. So if you have to slow them down because you're adding solar into the mix, they run less efficiently. So the whole system just doesn't make sense at all. I mean, you've got billions and billions of dollars spent into these solar panels, and yet they produce only about 1% of our overall power. I mean, it's a tiny fraction of the power. Now, in the middle of a day, at noon, they'll produce maybe a bit more than that, maybe 3% or so, but it's still a small amount. But the power stations, they have to wind down and they run less efficiently. Then you get voltage irregularities because, the way that the sun, it might be a cloud that goes over or what have you, and it's it's a bit haphazard. There's not a regular steady stream of power going into the grid.
Yeah, so you always have to have your baseload power supply functioning, and in fact you can't just turn off
Yep.
coal-fired power stations, can you?
No
it's
way.
Not a matter of just, oh, well, we've got solar power coming so we can just switch them off. And because you have to keep them going and you have to have them there in case the sun doesn't shine, you've always got to have that backup. You can't just say, oh, sorry, there's no power today because the sun's not shining. So you have to continue to fund this. You have to maintain all of the infrastructure right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so as some commentators have been saying, you've got less people bearing the burden of paying for that infrastructure because some people are kind of opting out of that national grid by supplying their own power.
Yeah. When people get these solar cells, they think it's great because they're not just reducing their bills and whatnot, but they're actually getting money by putting electricity back into the grid. They think it's great, but at the end of the day, everyone has to pay for it, and it's an enormously expensive exercise. But if we, for example, if we built just one coal-fired power station, that would be more than enough electricity to cover for the entire solar panels right across the whole country. There was a power station, a coal-fired power station that opened in Queensland in 2007, Kogan Creek Power Station. It cost $1.2 billion, which is fairly small considering that Australians have spent $8 billion of their own money on solar cells, not to mention the billions of dollars of subsidies. But just $1.2 billion would produce a 750 megawatt coal-fired power station, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. Now, and the thing is, that it's not even reducing greenhouse gases if you're worried about that, because they have to keep the coal-fired power stations running all the time.
Anyway,
because they can't just be switched on and off like a switch.
Exactly, and I should say the reason we bring this up is because, as some people may have seen, there's been a whole swath of articles across the media saying that during the recent heat waves in South Australia and Victoria, the saviour was solar power. There would have been more brownouts and so forth if we hadn't have had solar power. So
not at all. It's absolute nonsense. I've seen the figures, and in January when we had this heat wave a week ago, there was about a time when the solar cells across the eastern states, particularly Victoria and South Australia, they were producing about 3% at that peak demand period, about 3%. But for all the hassles it causes the conventional power station and all the billions of dollars were wasted on it, China's building one coal-fired power station every single week.
Wow.
We've only built just a handful in the last decade. We just need a couple of extra coal-fired power stations and of course go nuclear as well. And we'd have far more power, but not just when the sun shines, the whole time, 24 hours a day.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're worried about emissions, I mean, for one, nuclear doesn't have that problem, but for two, go to our website and have a look at the fraud of this whole global warming scam. And in fact, one of the other things that tips you off about what's going on here is the fact that Citibank has come out saying that there's a $64 billion market opportunity for solar and wind power, and they're saying that Australia is the most attractive market for solar in the world. So when you have banks coming in, promoting this, jumping on it, you know that the big bucks are going to go to big business and banks, as they always do, and it's the suckers that are being brought in, you and I, well, we don't have solar panels, but those that are, they might be on a good wicket at the moment, but the way the entire world economy is going, that is about to be wiped out because their very lives are at jeopardy from this whole green disease.
Well, we'd be paying for it.
Absolutely. Now, that's all we've got time for. Thanks for joining me, Jeremy.
Thanks, Elisa.
Thanks for tuning in, and come back again next week for the CEC Report.